Hey guys! So today we're going to be talking a little bit about probably our most infamous president of all, Richard Nixon. So Richard Nixon, when he runs for president, he is running after Lyndon Baines Johnson. And if you remember, Johnson's administration was kind of a disaster because of the Vietnam War. So people in 1968 are kind of ready for something different. And so what they like in Nixon is he is sort of this conservative, very traditional Republican. And a lot of people are kind of looking for that. A lot of things changed in the 60s, so people really kind of want to go back to the way things had been. And so they really start looking at Nixon as, very popular guy. He is a politician that's very well known. He had already been vice president once. And so he seems like the natural choice that the Americans are going to vote for. So in 1968, he wins against the Democratic candidate. So Nixon's main thing is that he really wants to, again, go back to a more traditional era. So he started something called New Federalism. So the goal of New Federalism is sort of to give power away from the federal government and back to the states. So under the Great Society, the federal government had increased substantially, right? So the idea behind New Federalism is basically that the states know where they need to spend money, right? The federal government can't know the specific needs of every state in the union. So one example of this is revenue sharing. So the state governments decide how to spend the federal money that they are given. Because the way it had been is the federal government says, hey, spend this on education, right? Well, maybe they give it to New York and New York's like, we don't really need the money for education. Our education system's fine, but our transportation is struggling, right? So under New Federalism, they can decide, well, you know what, I'm going to put this money towards transportation and improve that rather than towards education, which is already doing okay. So the idea, again, is that the states know better, right? They know what's wrong in their state. They know what their problems are, and so they can kind of decide in that way. The next thing that Nixon kind of proposes is the family assistance plan. So the idea behind this is that the welfare system, which had really been set up under FDR and then was still kind of working was increased under Lyndon Johnson, a lot of people were saying that there were some abuses that were being done of welfare. So the idea behind the family assistance plan is that in order to get welfare from the government, all recipients have to work, right? So they have to prove that they have a job and that they're trying to get a job. But as we know, sometimes jobs don't give you a minimum wage, or a minimum wage isn't enough to live on. So the family assistance plan also guaranteed every person $1,600 a month. That's a lot of money, right? Especially in this time, that's a substantial amount that you can live on. It's not huge, it's not, the best income in the world, but it still, gives you a little something to start. They also provide job training so that you can, in theory, get a better job in the future. So the idea behind this is rather than just giving money away, we'll train you to get a better job, right? So this sounds like a great compromise, doesn't it? It's both sides. Well, the Democrats said, that's not enough money. You're not giving enough. The Republicans are like, whoa, we shouldn't guarantee an income at all. That's a little communist, right? And so it ends up not passing Congress because of it. But I do want to give you this as an example of how Nixon really was trying to compromise in his administration, because that's not often what we imagine with Nixon. The next thing that we have is the budget. So basically the idea is that the government has been spending way, way too much money, right? And so Nixon kind of wants to balance the budget a little bit more. So he decides that, first of all, he's going to put more money towards some programs. So things like Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid. So that's, elderly and medical care for the elderly and people in poverty. Food stamps. He also puts money towards the Environmental Protection Agency and OSHA, which is a health and safety thing. If you are in Mr. Stiles' class or Miss Farrell's class, you probably know a little bit about OSHA. So protecting the environment, protecting the rights of people in the workplace. He also put some more money towards NASA and institutes some affirmative action policies. So affirmative action policies are policies that are put in place to help minorities get jobs. So rather than, giving the job, if you have two people who are applying for a job and they're both equally qualified, but one is a woman and one is a white man, you might give the job to the woman instead in order to increase your minorities in your position. Same holds true with like African Americans, Mexican Americans, other minority groups as well. But he also decides to take money away from others. So things like Job Corps and HUD, those are both Great Society programs. He also institutes a policy called impounding, where basically what he tries to do is he withhold money for the states until they carry out federal programs, right? So the idea is he's kind of bribing the states, right? Like, you have to do this, you have to do what I tell you to do, or you're not going to get any money from the government. The Supreme Court says that's unconstitutional. You can't do that. But this is an early example that maybe Nixon is a little bit more paranoid and a little bit more sketchy than we think he is. He also tries to increase taxes as well as cut some spending. Congress doesn't pass. Again, Democrats and Republicans can't agree, so those are not passed by Congress. But these are some biggies. All right, so Nixon's real thing is law and order. So Nixon, he says he is elected by a group known as the silent majority, and he says that most people want restoration of the U.S. post-Vietnam and want better enforcement for crime and drugs. The idea being that they're not the hippies, right? They're not out there causing a fuss. They're just your average American citizen who votes for Nixon without causing a riot, right? So even though it looks like most of the country is real liberal, well, he's elected by conservatives, right? And they're just the silent majority. So they're not out there, protesting or causing a fuss, like I said, but they make up the majority. Part of how he is going to enforce crime in the country at the time is he puts together what he calls his enemies list. And it is an actual list that Nixon comes up with of people he thinks are enemies to his goals, right? So he keeps an entire record of protest leaders. So like Abby Hoffman that we talked about when we looked at Forrest Gump, right? Radicals, people like civil rights leaders, right? All of these people are investigated by the FBI without their knowledge. They are wiretapped. They're basically being spied on, right? Again, this is a kind of like a hint that Nixon is super paranoid and maybe not all there, right? So that's going to cause a lot of issues when this idea of this enemies list comes out. He keeps it a secret for a while. Like, people don't really know about it until much later. So he also has what is called his Southern strategy. So his goal as part of his Southern strategy is to attract Southern Democrats. So most Southerners at this time are still voting Democrat, going back to the days of the Civil War, right? And so his idea is, a lot of those Democrats are actually kind of conservative Democrats anyway. So I got to get them to vote for me. Okay, well, part of the way to do that is to oppose desegregation. So one of the things that he opposes is busing. So busing is a law that was passed in 1971. It was required by the case of Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg. Yes, that is our Charlotte Mecklenburg in North Carolina, where basically what it said is that if you need to desegregate your schools, so if you have like the white school and the black school, one way that you can do this is take kids that are in the black school district and redistrict them to the white school district, right? And then what you will do is literally bus those kids over to the white school district. Well, a lot of times those kids might be on the bus for like an hour or so before they get to their school. And so a lot of moms did not like it. If you look at this picture, you notice these are middle-class white moms. They really disagree with busing, and busing continues to be an issue. We actually had a big busing issue in Wake County not too long ago. So the idea behind this is that we are trying to avoid, or the goal of busing is desegregation. the goal of Nixon opposing busing is to kind of say, hey, Southerners, right? I'm on your side. So again, civil rights, he's a little off on, right? Where Nixon was really an expert was foreign policy. So his foreign policy was something called Realpolitik, and that's a German phrase that means political realism. And the idea behind here is we've been kind of silly during the Cold War, right? Like, we went to war in Vietnam and Korea, countries that most Americans couldn't even find on a map. But we ignored China and pretended it was Taiwan, right? We didn't want to work with the Soviet Union despite the fact that they are one of the most powerful countries in the world just because they're communism. So the idea of Realpolitik is, let's just be pragmatic about it. You know what? We need to pay attention to powerful nations, even if they're communist. We need to ignore weak nations, even if they're communist, right? So yeah, we need to pay attention to China and the Soviet Union. We need to forget about Korea and Vietnam, right? So this policy is really enforced by Henry Kissinger, who is this guy down here in the bottom corner. He's Nixon's Secretary of State, and he is a political genius when it comes to foreign policy. And this begins an era known as the era of détente. So basically what happens here is that Cold War tension is eased under Nixon. So where we had been like neck and neck with the Soviet Union and getting ready to fight the Soviet Union for so long, Nixon's like, we just need to chill out, right? We need to just take a deep breath, move forward. So some examples of how this played out. First of all, Nixon becomes the first president in a long time to visit the nation of China. See his picture down here, Nixon and his wife on the Great Wall of China. He has dinner with Mao Zedong. So this is a big deal. The next thing he does is he actually goes to the Soviet Union and meets with Nikita Khrushchev there in the Soviet Union, or Gorbachev, sorry, in the Soviet Union. And they come up with a treaty called the SALT Treaty. And the long name of it is Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. But the idea behind the SALT Treaty is that we are going to limit our nuclear weapons. And this is the first limiting of nuclear weapons ever, right? The last example, so these first two examples are us paying attention to powerful countries, right? Paying attention to countries we hadn't really been paying attention to for a while. The last one is us beginning to ignore a weak country. So Nixon, one of his first actions is withdrawing from Vietnam. Now he does actually send one last big bombing of Vietnam, but then withdraws all of our troops. And by doing this, he's basically saying we're giving up, right? So the Vietnam War is kind of a surrender on our part. What will eventually happen is the North Vietnamese will invade the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon, and Saigon falls to North Vietnam. So Vietnam unifies under one country, under Ho Chi Minh, right? So it becomes a communist country, and we're kind of okay with that. We would not have been okay with that earlier in the Cold War. But under Nixon, we're just like, you know what? It's not our business anymore. We don't care, right? So that's a really big deal. So that kind of is an overview of Nixon's administration. One of the things I want you to get from this, a lot of times when we think of Nixon, we think of Watergate. We think of corruption, right? But Nixon was actually a very popular president in his time. And it's very important for you guys to understand that people liked Nixon. And so when Watergate scandal breaks, that's what makes it such a big deal, because they trusted Nixon, right? And Nixon had done some really good things for the American people up until this point. And so that's why Watergate is such a big deal. So the next video will look at Watergate for you, and you'll kind of see Nixon's downfall and all of that. But otherwise, I hope this gave you a good overview. Until next time.